Come to me. Come to me.
Hello and welcome to the Girl Horror Podcast. In this podcast, we look at the intersection between girlhood and horror. In today's episode, we'll be examining the much-anticipated Nosferatu, directed by Robert Eggers, providing you with a history of the original film that not only defined the vampire horror genre, but has also undergone some incredible transformations between then and the new version that has graced our cinema screens today. Our journey begins with the 1922 film Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, directed by F.W. Werner. This was an unauthorised adaptation of Bram Stoker's now infamous Dracula book, but introduced us to Count Orlok, a character whose presence has left an indelible mark on horror cinema to this day. Fast forward to 1979, and we encounter Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire. This remake pays homage to the original while infusing it with a romantic and tragic depth, offering a nuanced portrayal of the vampire mythos. Most recently, director Robert Eggers reimagined the classic tale of Nosferatu, bringing a new perspective to the vision of Count Orlok. In Eggers' style, this adaptation pays meticulous attention to historical detail and presents us as the audience with a visual style so haunting in its homage to the original that we cannot help but be mesmerised as its audience. If you can hear that noise in the background, that's my heating turning on. In this episode, we're going to traverse the historical evolution of Nosferatu, looking at how each adaptation reflects the era in which it was created, and how each has fed into the next to create a mythology of vampire lore around Count Orlok to last forever. We'll be looking at costume design as a vehicle for historic and emotional depth, exploring how attire can define a character and also add to the overall atmosphere of a film. Finally, in traditional girl horror style, we'll be discussing Nosferatu from a feminist perspective, exploring the portrayal of female characters and the underlying themes that relate to gender dynamics. And oh boy, are there many in this film. Now, without further ado, join us as we unravel the layers of Nosferatu, a film that continues to captivate and provoke thought nearly a century after its first release. Let's begin with the original film from 1922, Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror. This silent film is often regarded as the first vampire film, setting the stage for the genre itself to develop. It was an unauthorised adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but to get around the issue of copyright, which to be fair was not taken that seriously at the time, the filmmakers altered enough details to detach it from Dracula in content. Thus, Count Dracula became Count Orlok, and the setting was shifted to Germany. Despite these changes, Stoker's widow sued for copyright infringement, and a court ruling ordered all copies of the film to be destroyed. It's actually a miracle that we still have this film today, considering it was supposed to be wiped off the face of the planet. But thankfully, several prints survived, and the masterpiece that is Nosferatu was allowed to influence generations of horror filmmakers to come. Count Orlok, played by Max Schreck, I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, but we're going to go with it, in the 1922 silent film, is a departure from the suave vampires that we often see today. He has a gaunt figure, elongated fingers, and a rat-like feature. Orlok embodies a much more primal and terrifying version of a vampire than the clean, cute version that we know today. That's definitely meant to say clean cut. I really need to start proofreading my scripts. The clean cut version that we know today. Orlok's occult vampiricism focuses more on him being truly undead or reanimated dead than perhaps the more clinical, Christianized version that we are most familiar with. I can guarantee Stephanie Meyer's Cullens were not meant to be descendants of the grisly, half-rotten, reanimated dead body of Count Orlok, that's for sure. This original image of occult vampiricism is the root from which it's generally accepted that most depictions of vampires that have come since began. There's definitely a comparison to be made between Ellen and Orlok and Bella and Edward. I'm just saying, Bellen and Edwok, Ella and Orwood. Okay, I'll stop. Basically, it's important that you know this original silent film really was the start of vampire horror cinema. Murnau's Nosferatu is also an example of German expressionism, and this influenced the entire atmosphere of the film, and therefore vampire horror as we know it. German expressionism is characterised by its use of distorted sets, stark lighting contrasts, and surreal landscapes to evoke an emotional response from its audience. If you've seen the new film in the cinema, you'll know that Eggers was absolutely led by these German expressionist roots in recreating the story for the big screen. These stylistic choices not only heightened the original film's sense of dread and ominous longing, but also really cemented its status as a pioneer in visual storytelling.
At midnight, all sorts of evil spirits are set loose. People disappear without a trace.
Last night, after a tiresome journey, I finally reached my destination, the castle of Count Dracula.
If we fast forward to 1979, we encounter Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire, with a Y. This remake pays homage to the iconography of the original, while infusing it with Herzog's own unique vision too. Klaus Kinski steps into the role of Count Dracula, note the return to the original name, delivering a performance that's both menacing and also tragic. Herzog's adaptation delves deeper into the vampire's existential despair, portraying Dracula as a lonely, cursed being who yearns for love. Some people believe this more romantic and tragic angle adds layers of depth to the character, moving beyond the image of the purely evil vampire depicted in the original.
The ship seems burdened with a curse. One sailor and our cook have disappeared without a trace.
Critically, Herzog's Nosferatu was well received, praised for its atmospheric cinematography and Kinski's compelling performance. It stands as a testament to the timeless nature of the Nosferatu story, proving its adaptability to different eras and directorial interpretations. Also, it's just campy, and I don't know, it's a classic.
I've never shared my secret with any soul.
You've had these spells since childhood. Tell me what you can from the beginning.
It is like a dream. It was our wedding. When we turned around, everyone was dead. The stench of their bodies was horrible. Standing before me was death.
Most recently, Robert Eggers has taken his notoriously good directorial touch to reinventing the story of Nosferatu. Eggers is known for his meticulous and atmospheric films like The Witch and The Lighthouse.
Oh God, my Lord, I now begin. Oh, help me and don't leave my sin. For I repentant thou shalt be. From evil I will turn to thee. None ever shall destroy my faith. For I repentant thou shalt be. Oh God, my Lord, I now begin. Oh, help me and don't leave my sin. For I repentant thou shalt be. From evil I will turn to thee.
Let's leave the Lord.
And he certainly brought a dedication and admirable perspective to this new film. The new adaptation of Nosferatu stars the incredible and unrecognisable Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok, Lily Rose Depp as Ellen Hutter, Nicholas Hoult as her devoted husband, Thomas Hutter, Aaron Taylor-Johnson and Emma Corrin as their friends Frederick and Anna, and of course Willem Dafoe as Professor Albin Eberhard von Franz. I think that's how you say that.
I have seen things in this world that would have made Isaac Newton crawl back into his mother's womb. We have not become so much enlightened as we have been blinded by the gaseous light of science. I have wrestled with the devil as Jacob wrestled the angel in Penuel, and I tell you, if we are to tame darkness, we must first face that it exists.
This new film focuses on the character Ellen and her unusual and erotic relationship with the vampire Count Orlok. Eggers employs modern cinematic techniques to evoke... I literally don't know what that says. Why do I record this without... to evoke a thick atmosphere? That'll do, we'll go with thick atmosphere. Using desaturated colours and continuous fog to maintain a haunting visual style that is unsurprising from Eggers, but also works perfectly for this film. His approach combines the epic scale of previous work with psychological elements to create a film that's both incredibly grand, but also deeply personal. Eggers' Nosferatu could be seen as a kind of sister film to The Witch, as both explore themes of female autonomy and societal repression. In this adaptation, Count Orlok represents the politics of female pleasure, adding a contemporary layer and an apt modern discussion to the classic tale.
There is a devil in this world, and I have met him.
But you could never please me as he could.
As we can see, Nosferatu has undergone significant transformation since its inception. Each adaptation reflects the sensibilities and concerns of its time, from Murnau's expressionist horror to Herzog's romantic tragedy, and now Eggers' feminist exploration. The tale of Count Orlok continues to captivate and evolve, just as it did when it began a history of vampire horror in cinema in 1922. Before we move on to indulging ourselves by looking at the incredibly fun costume designs of the Nosferatu world, I want to look in more detail at the copyright dispute that surrounds the original Nosferatu film. Honestly, I have a weird soft spot for copyright law, and personally find it very interesting to see how we developed from plagiarism after plagiarism to the legal right to prevent others from stealing your work. As we've already mentioned, the 1922 Nosferatu film's creation led to a copyright dispute that almost led to the film being erased from history. Nosferatu was an unauthorised adaptation of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. Florence Stoker, the widow of the author and the executor of his estate... The executor of his estate? I'm so tired. The executor of his estate. Oh dear. Became aware of the film's release and initiated legal proceedings against Prana Film, the production company behind Nosferatu. She sued them for copyright infringement, arguing that the film was a direct adaptation of her late husband's novel and that the proper permissions should have been sought before its creation. Honestly, this is kind of a baddie move from Florence Stoker if you consider the world she lived in and their perspective on women taking the helm and being outspoken. The German courts ruled in her favour and acknowledged that the infringement was true, resulting in a court decree that all copies of Nosferatu the film were to be destroyed. Prana Film, already struggling with financial difficulties, declared bankruptcy and were unable to pay any damages at all. Instead, the company dissolved, with Nosferatu being its only production. Despite this incredible downfall and the court's order of destruction for the film, several copies of Nosferatu mysteriously survived. The film had already been distributed internationally, and some prints were still in circulation. Over time, these surviving copies resurfaced, and Nosferatu slowly gained recognition and appreciation as a seminal work in the horror genre. Ironically, the legal battle that ensued from the creation of the 1922 Nosferatu gave it a level of notoriety that actually contributed to a renewed interest in Bram Stoker's Dracula too. I honestly think if they had worked together to create this adaptation, it could have helped them both. But this version of events is much more juicy. The publicity surrounding the case helped to cement Dracula's status in popular culture as we know it, and influence future adaptations and interpretations of vampire lore itself. Not to be a nerd, but the copyright dispute over Nosferatu is a fascinating highlight of the complexities of intellectual property rights in the early 20th century, and underscores the film's resilience and enduring impact on horror cinema itself. In the next section of this episode, and as per listener request, we'll be discussing how Nosferatu's costume design has evolved over the decades, influencing and reflecting the aesthetics of its time over and over again. In F.W. Murnau's 1922 classic, Count Orlok's appearance is nothing short of iconic. Portrayed by Max Schreck, Orlok is characterised by his elongated features, his bold head and his gaunt frame. He wears austere clothing which complements his eerie demeanour, a dark, long coat with a high collar being the most recognisable part of his so-called uniform. He's minimalist in many ways in this first adaptation, but also haunting in his offness. This first image sets an incredible precedent for the visual portrayals of vampires that will follow in the next 100 years of cinema, emphasising otherworldliness and also a kind of predatory nature. Werner Herzog's 1979 remake pays homage to its original counterpart, but also introduces period-accurate costumes too. Klaus Kinski's Count Dracula wears clothing that reflects the 19th century setting, with very detailed fabrics and designs that add depth to the character. This approach not only humanises the vampire and grounds the supernatural elements in a tangible reality, but also influences subsequent vampire aesthetics by blending historical authenticity with horror. As a society of vampire lovers, who do we love more than a historically accurate-ish vampire? Honestly, I couldn't tell you. Now, in Robert Eggers' new film, costume designer Linda Meir plays a pivotal role in bringing the haunting realism of Eggers' style and the story itself to life. Set in 1838 Germany, Meir's designs are a masterclass in Gothic costuming, blending historical authenticity, of course, with folklore and tradition too. Meir's meticulously researched 1830s fashion to make sure that the costumes accurately reflect the period styles, incorporating elongated silhouettes, rich textures, and a monochromatic colour palette that really evokes a truly Gothic aesthetic, harking back to the original film wholeheartedly. Count Orlok's costume reflects centuries of decay. His clothes in this film are evidently supposed to show his 300 years of ever-decaying existence. The goal seems to have been to depict centuries of rot and neglect, with meticulous aging and distressing techniques used to enhance the skeletal and putrid image that Eggers wanted for his central character. Personally, I love this about Eggers' film. Orlok is not supposed to be the dapper, handsome Dracula that we know. He's literally supposed to be a rotting corpse, and we're supposed to believe that Ellen's love for him is not because he is some hunk, but because she has some mortal curse and a never-ending attachment to him as a demonic, evil being. Orlok is not extravagant. He's a different version and experience of the vampire stereotype. Eggers is interested in the fear that comes from the belief that something is real. Count Orlok has been a young man once, 300 years ago, and the remnants of him are there, albeit hiding in his castle for the first part of the film. The shape of the collar on his outer coat is reminiscent of a cape, but it importantly is not a cape. The coat is based on research done on local shepherds and Romanian men of the time. The overly long and highly impractical sleeves were never meant to be worn on your actual arms, but always as a kind of cloak over their outfits, especially for the richer folk who would be adorned in sashes and lace and buttons underneath. Orlok, however, isn't using this as a presentation device, but he is using it as a hiding place under which to shrink his 300-year-old body. Looking at Ellen, Lily Rose Depp is seen adorned in costumes that have been designed to highlight the societal constraints under which she lives, as well as her inherent vulnerability. Her outfits also hint at the difficult and constrained erotic pull of her relationship with Orlok himself. Ellen is the heart of this story, and goes through such horrors throughout this film. Lily Rose Depp herself has expressed her adoration for the costumes she was able to wear throughout the film, starting with brighter colours and ending up with more muted colours until she eventually is wearing all black. Eggers' Ellen has a backstory and a nostalgic connection to this vampire, and her costumes all but explain this in black and white, and muted pastel tones too. Ellen comes from a family of money, but she's settled with Mr. Hutter, and she is so content with this change despite her husband wanting her to live the rich life she did. Linda worked with Robert to ensure that the visuals that were embedded in the script were truly expressed as he hoped they would be, and you can really tell. Working with Lily Rose Depp to clothe Ellen was a special moment for Linda. Her clothes depict her social status and her taste. Ellen doesn't care if she repeats her outfits, something I think we all can learn from, actually. Ellen goes through this journey that is largely in her mind, living in terror for herself and mostly what will happen to Thomas. She isn't thinking about what she's wearing. She's doing the bare minimum of what society requires of her. That still means big dresses, puffy dresses, all of that, but, we take the positives. I want to take a moment to talk about the corset scene. as it's such a poignant moment for Ellen and the fact that this story is told from her perspective. During a moment of pain and arguable hysteria, Ellen's male companions decided, admittedly thinking they were doing her a favour, to tighten her corset in order to provide her some relief. I'm not sure whether they thought her being mentally breaking and spilling her turmoil into the room would be prevented from her being physically smaller, or just that they had some perverse image that a tight corset would somehow hold her all in. Linda has explained in interviews that the type of corset she is wearing in that scene, the fan corset, is historically accurate, but also can be tightened from the front instead of the back. This was a deliberate decision, so that as the viewer we are able to see her pain in that moment, where those around her are trying to make her smaller, make her take up less space, and denying her validation of what she is experiencing. In the scene, we see her face, we see the corset, and we see the men trying and failing to help her. And that is the level of thinking that I personally think should go into every costume design. Chef's kiss. Linda Mayer's collaboration with Robert Eggers in Nosferatu exemplifies how meticulous costume design can enhance storytelling itself, creating a visual narrative that resonates with audiences right from those in 1922 through to us today, as we sit cosy in our cinema seats and lose ourselves in the Carpathian Mountains. In the final part of this episode, we're going to, of course, look at the film from a girl horror perspective. We're going to delve into the portrayal of female characters and examine how their roles have evolved from passive figures to complex individuals who strive for agency that is beyond the allowances of the societies they live in. In both F.W. Murnau's 1922 original and Werner Herzog's 1979 remake, female characters, notably Ellen or Lucy in some versions, are depicted in passive roles, embodying the damsel in distress trope that is so notorious of early horror. The primary function of these women was to serve as objects of desire or catalysts for the male action. They lack autonomy and agency, whether they like it or not. Ellen's ultimate sacrifice to defeat Count Orlok is portrayed as an act of passive submission, not one of empowered decision-making. She is the victim of his whim and is powerless to prevent it. This reinforces traditional gender norms and stereotypes of the time, because of course women actually can only ever do what a man wants of her. In 2024, Robert Eggers' adaptation presents a shift in the image of Ellen and the portrayal of women generally, but one that I appreciate still pays homage to the context of the original films too. Eggers reimagines Ellen as a more complex character. She has more agency, depth, and autonomy throughout the film, instead of just being a victim, although I doubt anyone will say she is not. Ellen is a key player in her own story and actively engages in her own circumstances, making conscious decisions that drive the narrative forward instead of being a pawn to a man's story. The evolution reflects a more contemporary understanding of female empowerment, and also I think gives more credence to the story itself. Personally, I find it less interesting if Ellen has no choice but to be raptured by the allure of Count Orlok. Count Orlok? God, I'm tired. But for Ellen to have agency in that decision to an extent opens up an entirely new way of looking at the scenario. I mean, she is still naive and doesn't know what she's getting herself into, but she demonstrates a kind of quote-unquote monstrous femininity that is unbecoming of a well-to-do woman like herself, and which makes me love her in this adaptation even more. She wants the rotten flesh man, and nobody is going to stop her, even her beloved and devoted husband. Women yearn for the rot, I'm telling you. Anyway, Ellen's autonomy in this new film frames her ultimate act against Count Orlok as a deliberate choice, emphasising her control over her own destiny and challenging the common notion that women can only ever be passive to their surroundings. There is also an interesting view of the power dynamics between Ellen and Count Orlok, which is intricately explored, shedding light on themes of obsession and desire itself. Kitten's biting the cable to my headphones. That's not for you. You can say hi? What's this? Boop. Oh, pause on the microphone. Nope, that is not a scratch post. What's wrong? He wants to be involved. Anyway, I digress. Ellen's interactions with Orlok show the complexities of consent and the objectification inherent in their relationship. This offers a critique of patriarchal structures themselves. The film critiques societal constraints imposed on women, particularly with regards to sexuality. Ellen's sexuality is portrayed as a medical issue, with her desires scrutinised and controlled, contrasting with male characters whose sexual behaviours are considered entirely normal. This portrayal challenges the double standards and stigmatisation of female sexuality. In summary, the evolution of Ellen's character from 1922 and 1979 to 2024 reflects a broader shift towards recognising and portraying female agency and complexity in the cinema. Eggers' Nosferatu offers a nuanced feminist critique, examining themes of autonomy, desire, and societal constraints, and providing a platform for discussions on women's roles and representations in horror and beyond. And there you have it. We've come to the end of this episode of Girl Horror, where we've journeyed through the dark and gothic history of Nosferatu, slightly chaotically with heating and kittens and all kinds of shenanigans. From its 1922 origins as F.W. Murnau's unauthorised Dracula adaptation to Werner Herzog's 1979 remake, and finally Robert Eggers' bold 2024 reimagining, Nosferatu remains a milestone of horror cinema, no matter which way you cut the cake. Its evolution reflects not just the challenging face of horror, but also the ongoing dialogue between tradition and innovation in storytelling. Costume design has been hugely important in the shaping of the Nosferatu films and in their lasting impact. Count Orlok's distinctive silhouette in the 1922 film set the standard for vampire iconography, while Herzog's 1979 adaptation grounded its character in period-appropriate attire-ish. Eggers' 2024 adaptation took fashion very seriously with its Lindenmere designs, blending historical authenticity with gothic elements to enhance the narrative's themes of decay, societal constraints on women, and general unearthly desire. The costumes don't just clothe the characters, they give them depth, grounding their stories in a rich visual world that invites us in handwritten ink to enjoy the dread and beauty of their adventures. Eggers' reimagining of Nosferatu challenges and redefines the role of women in horror, given by its forebearers. By giving Ellen agency and complexity, he reframes her narrative from one of a passive victim to one of active participation. Themes of autonomy, sacrifice, and societal repression resonate deeply with contemporary audiences as we continue to discuss, and more importantly fight for, freedom and autonomy in society today. Ellen's story is about survival, but it's also a critique of the structures that have historically, and unfortunately presently, sought to limit women's choices and desires, identities and freedom. Nosferatu has always been a reflection of its time, and Eggers' adaptation proves that even a century later, it can still terrify, captivate and provoke thought that is just as relevant today. And on that delightful note, that's it for today's episode. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join me on our next episode. Don't forget you can find us on Instagram @girlhorror with a U for more updates, including behind the scenes content. If you want to help support the show, please consider leaving a review wherever you listen or buying a £3 coffee from my Ko-Fi page. If not, why not share this episode with a friend who loves girl horror too? Until next time, stay girly and stay horrifying.
You will remain and well rest yourself.
I must object, my lord.
You will obey this my counsel.
But, my lord... Count?